A History of English Literature from Earliest Times to 1916 by Arthur Compton-Rickett. This book was part of my syllabus when I was doing my English honours in Loreto College, Darjeeling. And this is completely out of print and so in public domain and not available anywhere else but with me. A History of English Literature, Part 1, narrated by Anita Saran. English Literature in the Making. Introduction. History's true object of study, says Fustel de Coulanges, is the human mind. Whatever objections may be urged against this definition, it certainly possesses the merit of emphasizing the psychological bond that connects history with literature. Any account of a nation's march in bygone times must reveal to some extent its mental characteristics, just as any record of its literature must disclose some pulsings of its social life. While, therefore, a history of English literature is a history of the inner life, a record of dreams and ideals, it needs to be limned on a background of its social activities in order to be clearly seen and nicely appraised. Oliver Wendell Holmes once reminded us that the human soul was an omnibus in which sit the shades of our ancestors. So the first thing to recognize in dealing with our imaginative life is its complex inspiration. Looking at the splendid fabric of English literature, we realize in it a coat of many colors, for it is shot with the varying tints of racial characteristics. To its making have gone the prismatic fancy of the Celt, the sombre passion of the Teuton, the golden gaiety of France, Scandinavian greys, Italian purples. Yet for all its composite character, it is not a thing of patchwork quality, but an harmonious blend in which one element predominates. That element is the Anglo-Saxon. We have only to analyze some passage of representative modern poetry to realize how, despite our linguistic debts to France, to Italy, and to Greece, the Saxon tongue is the one outstanding feature in our speech. The first indwellers of our islands were a rude primitive race that we term Paleolithic. A devoted geologist, Mr. James Cross, has spent many years searching for evidence of Paleolithic culture in the tertiary deposits swept together by the Thames near Gravesend. The present river flows at least 100 feet below the deposits of silt and gravel in which Mr. Cross's fine series of London paleoliths were found. They can be seen at the Royal Scottish Museum in Edinburgh. The tomahawk is the weapon most generally met with a flint or stone with a butt or bruising end, a cutting edge, a well-marked strengthening rib, and a tang to which the wooden shaft is bound. This was bound to a split stick with a fibre fastening. With these, hand daggers were found heavy at the base and sharply pointed, with a carefully hollowed place for the thumb and fingertips. Strangely enough, all these paleoliths were found within a strictly limited area. All the evidence goes to show that the site of the Paleolithic finds was a ford by which the primitive Londoners crossed the Thames. If men lay there in wait for the game which might come to the ford to drink, or the traveller who might be passing that way, it is easy to see why weapons would be found in the river's silt at that spot and nowhere else. But, however this may be, there existed the ford over the Thames in Paleolithic times. The dark, curly-haired, narrow-headed, dwarfish men who succeeded them, those of the Neolithic age, overran the country and possessed it until the Celts ran their keels ashore upon the gravels and sands of Kent. Doubtless they cut their terraced fields, their long grave burrows, and communal earthworks where London now stands. Then came the first Celtic invasion, the Goidels or the Gaels. These men drove the inhabitants to the west and north, but thoroughly intermingled with them, and the Gael persists to this very day. A second inroad of Aryan people came in about 300 BC and has been distinguished from the first by the term Brythons. These invaders did not spread so far as the Gaels, settling largely in the southwest and west, and becoming known later as the Cymry, or as the English call them, the Welsh. Their spirit glows in the magical verse of Mr. W. B. Yeats and the imaginative prose of Synge. It animates the fantasies of Fiona Macleod, and by its spell, George MacDonald achieved his highest flights of romantic beauty. Thus, Brythons, Gaels, and Neolithic were now closely intermingled. The Cymry have their own literature, a literature of war songs, serious legends with a stern and melancholy note that mingled later with the gay and lively fancy of the Norman romancers, sobering its mercurial gaiety, and in the process taking on itself more varied and plastic moods. That mingled later with the gay and lively fancy of the Norman romancers, sobering its mercurial gaiety, and in the process taking on itself more varied and plastic moods. The Roman occupation of Britain affected our literature only in one particular, that is, in the indirect religious influence it brought to bear upon the inhabitants, first through the Christianized Cymry, secondly through the missionary priests in the 7th century. Formative influences in English literature. From the foregoing sketch of our literature, certain formative influences will have emerged: the Saxon, the Celtic, the Danish, and the Norman. It may not be amiss at this point to develop and clarify these. The Saxon genius of the race voiced itself more readily in social and political life than in literature. It was essentially practical and orderly. Passion and imagination were not alien but subordinate qualities. For the characteristics most insistent in the Saxon were those precisely that made for sound and efficient national life: patience and perseverance, the capacity for obedience, an instinct for law and method, the spirit of adventure, power of endurance, and fidelity to a cause that has once touched the emotions. Qualities such as these more easily and more naturally find congenial expression in political institutions and social initiative. In themselves, they prepare the soil for great literature rather than directly create it. They act as fertilizers, giving strength and vitality to the vegetation, restraining wild luxuriance, and eliminating the weeds. To speak of the unimaginative Saxon, as some Celtic enthusiasts do, is absurd. It is not the quantity but the quality of his imagination that differentiates him from the Celt and Norman. His imagination is clear and intense, with a certain fierce simplicity and bleak directness, whereas the Celtic imagination is iridescent and exuberant, subtle and pervasive rather than simple and strong, elusive and mystical rather than direct and practical. As against these diverse types, there is the equally distinctive imagination of the Norman, livelier and nimbler than the other two, lacking the solid tenacity of the Saxon and the ironic melancholy of the Celt, but excelling in gaiety, animal spirits, and a logical inventiveness derived from Latin sources. In the making of our poetry, the Saxon imagination is seen to best advantage in simple love ballads, in verse infused with strong yet tender piety, in the epic where its capacity for lucidity and repression is happily marked. In the making of our prose, its influence is more emphatic for reasons not hard to understand. Too rigid in texture, too prone to economy of effects, its inspiration in verse is necessarily circumscribed. Simplicity, temperance of expression, clarity, and high seriousness of purpose find happier medium in prose, and history, science, and speculative thought owe much to its integrating power. Turning to the influence of the Celt, we realize that if the Saxon brought intensity, the Celt as certainly brought variety. To our poetry he gave subtle shades of meaning, delicate nuances of humour and pathos, a wealth of rich fancies like the network of tracery that adorns the Gothic cathedral. To our prose the Celt brought the gift of satire and ironic introspection, from mordant and savage to a mood of elfish mockery. Fine passionate love of nature and mystical interpretation of her phenomena that differs widely from the half-fearful, if stoical, attitude of the Saxon in face of the primal facts of life. There is a fundamental affinity between the Danish and the Saxon influence. The Dane merely repeated in somewhat cruder fashion the spirit of the Anglo-Saxon invaders. Directly, it was a negative influence on literature and retarded the progress of our tongue for some time. But indirectly, in the long run, it welded the people more closely together and infused into verse much of that compelling attraction for the sea that meets us in early English literature. Neither the Saxon nor the Celt by himself would have made our literature the great heritage it is, but in conjunction the one happily supplemented the other. And our greatest poetry and finest prose is that in which the Celtic and Teutonic elements are the most closely intermingled. Where the one offered strength, the other gave grace. Saxon simplicity and orderliness straightened out the ebullient extravagance of the Celtic mind, and the plastic charms of the latter softened the stiffer outlines of the English genius. Without the driving power of the Saxon, the dreams of the Celt would have been like exquisite stardust, drifting ineffectually through the literary firmament. The Norman influence, though less insistent than the Celtic and Saxon, is more complex. There was a Celtic element, of course, in the Norman, and with this he mingled something of the Latin South and the Norse. The Normans were Northmen, softened and modified by southern intercourse. It seemed, at first, after the conquest, as if the Norman influence would be the paramount one, for it started a fresh era of literary history with the suppression of the native tongue. The cultured life of the day was ruled by French and Latin models. An age of Latin writers was inaugurated. Latin, of course, was no new thing to the English clergy. It had been spoken and written by them for centuries. But the close contact with Rome, inaugurated at the conquest, extended its dominion to an extraordinary extent. French became the language of the well-born, and the English vernacular was deliberately disregarded. France at this time was the intellectual center of Western Europe. Quick and adaptable in her temperament, she set the pace and others followed as best they might. France was by no means profoundly original. Her body of literature was inferior in quality to that of England before the conquest. But she had the gift of purloining the ideas of others and transforming them into an especially acceptable form. A remarkable illustration of this is furnished by the Arthurian cycle, which was originally Celtic in its inspiration, but owing to French redaction and elaborations, became one of the most popular of European romances. We have sketched the chief formative influences in our literature. At a later date, Italy, Spain, and France exerted a potent influence upon English letters. Italy in the early Renaissance, Spain in the late Renaissance, and France during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. There was also in the late Middle Ages a touch of Far Eastern thought, and during the Renaissance, more than a touch of Greek idealism upon our literature. Notwithstanding these many influences, the two most considerable are the Celtic and the Saxon, that so closely commingled at the time of the conquest as to be inseparable. The greatness of our literature, then, is due to these two great formative influences. If you find this helpful and would like to support my voice work and the preservation of rare texts, you'll find a link in the description. Thank you for listening.